You're watching the uncensored debate right now. Let's get straight into it. More than 300 people died and the country suffered more than 50 billion rands worth of damage to property and business in the aftermath of the unrest that gripped the country in July last year. A report on the ensuing chaos has found, among other things, that dysfunctional relationships, let me say that word again, dysfunctional relationships between several departments and the security cluster played into the hands of the plotters of the violent unrest and looting that drew the world's attention to South Africa's unstable political landscape. Joining us now to discuss this further, we're joined by Dr. Yaki Cilliers. He's from the Institute of Security Studies, News 24 political editor, Konita Hunter, and Tato Masiangwako of the Socioeconomic Rights Institute. To all of you, thank you very much for making the time for this important discussion. Let me ask the question and start with you, Dr. Cilliers. When the former defense minister said to me on Thursday outside Parliament that the National Security Council, which is chaired by the President, had not set since the days of former President Thabo Mbeki. In fact, her words were, since Thabo Mbeki left office. It bowled me over because I didn't understand what question to ask next. But my time was up anyway with her, so I could exit that interview. But when you heard those words, could that be part of the reason why we found ourselves where the country was in July last year?
Good afternoon. Yes, well, certainly it's one of the reasons. The report is scathing in the extent to which there were these overlapping functions and responsibilities and simply a lack of coordination. And the problem does not lie in the structures, because on paper the structures all exist. The problem lies in the fact that nobody heeds any attention to them. And that is the function when you have a party and a government where there is no consequence management. From the top, where nobody is held to account, then it should be no surprise that nobody pays any heed to the intelligence that is provided, to their need to coordinate, to share, because there's such a degree of infighting from the different factions that you have an incoherent government. So it is a source of concern, and we need to fix this going forward, because as the report says, it's not if, it's only a question of when we are going to see further violence.
Yeah. Konita Hunter, you shook your head when I said or repeated what the Speaker of National Parliament, in her capacity as former Defense Minister, had to say. What do we know about the National Security Council, or how important a structure is it?
We know that it was a big function of the Mbeki era, and it was sort of, outlawed, done away with during the Zuma era. But I think it's disingenuous for her to say, it's not something since the Mbeki era, because we know in the 2020 State of the Nation address, the President announced as part of his reforms in the security cluster that was going to happen. In March of that year, there was a formal, by law, reconstitution of the National Security Council. So on paper, it did exist by the time the unrest happened. The question, however, is why did the President, despite the fact that there was numerous intelligence warnings in the beginning of 2021, why did he not constitute meetings of that council? Because he is chairperson of the National Security Council, bringing together ministers of the security cluster, intelligence heads, etc. And as the report said, the National Security Council met too late. It met, in the middle of the unrest, and the response was unsatisfactory. Worse than that for me is that after July happened, Professor Sandri Afrika and her colleagues note, the National Security Council barely sat to take stock of what happened. And the blame for that can be put at the President's door, because it's the President who chairs the National Security Council. And it's the President who made a lot of fanfare about it when he reconstituted it 2 years or so before. And so this is not something that was not there, or he didn't, this was a mechanism that he sought to introduce as a reform and then ignored it. And this could be said about a lot of the issues in the security cluster. A lot of the president was warned of. I mean, there's a part in the Professor Sandy Africa report, Toli, that a lot of us knew about, the infighting between ministers that played out on our televisions, right? The fighting between Kesla Sitole and the police minister. But what shocked me was that there was an admission by this report that the ministers went to KwaZulu-Natal with no mandate by the president. They had no instruction from their boss why they went to KZN. So that's why everyone was doing their own thing. The president did not give them instructions as to what they ought to have done in the middle of a crisis.
Sure. And we're going to revisit the incoherence within cabinet, because that as well is spoken about at length in that report. But Ms. Masiangwako, let's come to you. You, as the Socioeconomic Rights Institute, you were quite present and you were very much part and parcel of the issues in the Marikana massacre. And we all know what the report said as part of the findings by the Marikana inquiry, particularly when it came to police behavior. To listen to the National Police Commissioner when he was testifying before the inquiry that was run under the auspices of the Human Rights Commission, and to hear him say that there was a lapse in as far as communication within just the police service themselves, that for me, it took me straight back to the events of the Marikana massacre in August 2012. When we hear that again, are we ever going to be guaranteed in the country that we have a well-oiled machine when we talk about our public order police?
Yeah, I mean, what you've laid out, of course, is really disturbing because, funny enough, that report was only made public to us in March last year. But some of the things that report highlighted was the need to, maintain a public order policing unit that was sufficiently capacitated and had the right number of people. Of course, the extent to which that report has been implemented, we're yet to find out. Another thing that you mentioned, of course, is the lapse in communication and intelligence. This was mentioned way back when the Farlam Commission sat. And again, these are issues that this expert panel is revisiting. So I think the problem that we're dealing with is really a failure to listen to the recommendations. There have been numerous panel reports that have made the same kind of recommendations to the police. And unfortunately, we're not seeing a leadership at the top of the police that is willing to really just deal with all of these recommendations and see to it that they're implemented to the best of government's ability. It is quite disturbing, of course, that we have to keep having the same kind of reports coming out and saying the same kind of thing. This report itself also echoes the fact that, the expert panel, the panel of experts that followed the Farlam Commission of Inquiry needs to be implemented. But we only had a sitting on that with the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee on Police late last year, even though it was released much earlier. So, all of these issues, I think, continue to build on each other, and they're highlighted when a crisis like what happened in July unfolds right before our eyes.
Yeah. Dr. Cilliers, the president has vowed to restructure the security architecture of the country, and I suspect he's going to say that work is well underway to doing that. And I remember interviewing him on the back of the ANC 110th anniversary celebrations, and I asked him about this specific question, and basically the sum total was that we are working towards this. We now know that Minister Mondli Gungubele is not only just minister in the presidency, he is now also Minister of State Security. The way you see things, is that, are we going towards this restructure? Are we well on our way?
Well, the Sandy Africa report makes note of the fact that there's been minimal progress with regard to the appointment of capable senior people within state security intelligence. And, the problem, there are many problems within the State Security Agency. The biggest is that everything is a secret. So nobody knows what's happening. So I have little confidence until I see some action that there is, in actual fact, appropriate senior appointments made. And there was in the newspapers quite a lot of speculation, of course, between the appointment or shifting within the Minister of Police and the National Commissioner. But the problem is that what we want is we want an independent panel that we have some trust in that makes these appointments. If we are to insulate the security sector from political interference, then we need to make sure that it is not some political faction within the ANC that makes the appointments, but that it is an independent panel grouping that does this, so that you have capable and competent men and women that are appointed to these top positions, to the extent that if the ANC would lose power tomorrow, that there would be no need to restructure or replace them. So there are certain challenges here. The Constitution gives the President inordinate power in this regard, but that can be changed. We don't need a constitutional amendment. But that is absolutely critical, the appointment of capable, non-factional, if that word exists, people to the top echelons across the civil service. Cadre deployment is intimately linked with the challenge that the ANC has with black economic empowerment. And unfortunately, the way we have gone about this has really undermined accountability in South Africa, and the chickens have come home to roost. We need to relook how that is done. And it is in our common interest that be done yesterday, not today.
Juanita Hunter, when we return, I'd like you to start thinking about what Dr. Cilliers has just spoken about, and that is to insulate the security cluster or the security forces of our country from political interference. I'd like you to think about that in the context where the President says South Africa is not the first country to want to move the Department of Intelligence into the presidency. And those were his words to me when I interviewed him earlier this year. So we'll pick up from that point on when we return. You're watching the debate uncensored, and we are discussing the July unrest report. And let's head straight to my panel now. Juanita Hunter, let's talk about the factional battles in the ANC that in this report say that they disabled the security agency from responding adequately to the July unrest. Where do we start in fixing the problem?
You see, there's a few manifestations of that. The first is intelligence has so much been part of the ANC factionalism, and so much of it has spilled over in intelligence, right? So as intelligence operatives, there's almost this kind of whatever's left, whatever capacity is left, as Dr. Cilliers has said, there is this tentativeness of we need to see which way the political wind is swinging before we come in as intelligence. That's on the first hand. The second hand is there is the personality clashes as a result of internal ANC factionalism. And what happens then is that this minister will have this person in crime intelligence, but that person in crime intelligence may not be the head of crime intelligence as the minister would want. And so you have that type of spillover of ANC factionalism into the top echelons of the security cluster. And then the third manifestation of it in the July unrest was just loyalty to former President Jacob Zuma, which, proved to be very strong in certain strands of the security cluster. And so it was, an issue of inaction, with some sort of political motivation. Which is completely absurd, because security officials and the security cluster need to do their job, which is to protect the lives and the safety of South African citizens. And as the report pointed out, this did not happen. Now, The one thing you mentioned before we went on break, Tori, was about the president's. So the president has only made one move since the unrest. He took intelligence on paper and he moved it to his office. He did this in August last year.
Yeah.
For months, there was no clarity to say, if you don't have a minister of intelligence, it means the president, and by law that's possible, is the Minister of Intelligence, which means the minister must go to the Joint Standing Committee of Intelligence and report to Parliament as someone who is the executive authority on. The president will have to sign off on everything that the minister who would have delegated the authority to.
Yeah.
And then when they realized that that's not working and a deputy minister by law can't do much because he thought, Zizi Kodwa could handle it, then by law this couldn't happen. Months later, they realized, no, let's just give it to Mandliko Ngobele. Now you have a minister who's in charge of state security, who's in charge of DCIS, who's in charge of the National Planning Commission, all while the SSA is completely denuded. It does not have a director general, and it has not had one since permanent one since 2018.
Yeah.
It does not have a domestic intelligence head. The foreign intelligence head is on suspension, and that suspension has been renewed now. So it's been months and months and months, right? Then you talk about crime intelligence. There's instability there. Then you have the issue between the stalemate between the police commissioner and the police minister, something that the president can intervene in. So this doesn't need bold reform at this particular moment to stabilize the security cluster. All you do is do your job as president by filling in those vacancies in a way that's suitable, so that you can have some level of stability, that there's not a continued thievery. And it was quite damning to see Professor Sandy Afrika pointing to the president's own report from the High Panel Review report written by Dr. Sidney Mufumadi 3 years ago, that pointed out to the problems in the State Security Agency. And they said a lot of the solution lays in that if you implemented that report. And so my worry about this report, I have two worries really about the report by Professor Sandy Afrika and her two colleagues. Yeah. The first was, how does the president commission a report, an investigation into the security cluster, by not giving them any authority to have minutes of meetings, any intelligence reports during that time? So they don't know what happened at NICOC at that time. They don't know what was the discussions at Nat Jones. They don't know what the intelligence warnings were. They had a few documents, which was the intelligence estimates that, pointed a very bad picture, a very bad picture, but it was not the complete picture.
Yeah.
And that was the first thing. And the second thing is, the president has a track record of commissioning reports, commenting on them publicly to, almost agreeing with them to say, yes, look how bad things are, and then sitting on those reports. And so for me, just listen to the words that he announced. Basically, he promised to do the bare minimum, to fill some vacancies, to make some appointments in the top of the security cluster. This is something he should have done a long time ago.
Tato, let me come to you and ask you the question. When we were told by the presidency on the back of the release of this report that the president would talk about the July unrest, or perhaps would make some announcements around that, would it have been too much to expect of the president to say something definitive about the future of the National Police Commissioner? Because we know he has put him on tenterhooks to say, explain to me why you should not be suspended, or perhaps a board of inquiry might just be called to look into your fitness for office. Would it have been too much to ask or expect of the president to make some kind of clarity around the future of the National Police Commissioner?
That's an important question. And this report, throughout the report, you see the tension that unfolded, and how that tension between the Minister of Police and the National Commissioner possibly contributed to the police's inefficiency to sufficiently deal with what happened in July. The National Commissioner's position, I think, has been drawn into question for quite some time now. And so to continue to have a person in that position, which is a very important position for how the police functions, to continue to have someone who is embattled in the way that he is, continue to, I think, erode the morale of the police. And so I don't think it is too much to have expected the president to have said something definitive about his future. At this point, I think the police need, as a matter of urgency, to deal with their problems of leadership, which is an issue that has been lamented, I think, for many, many years. The crisis at the top is a direct there's a direct connection between the crisis at the top with how the police function on a day-to-day basis on the ground. So absolutely, I agree.
Yaki, can I ask you just a simple question? Do you know at least, as a security expert, who the masterminds of the July unrest were, and have they been arrested, to your knowledge?
Well, remember the original announcement when, what was it, 12 people, instigators, were behind this, or how I may, and that they were going to be brought to book. That, of course, has not happened. That's not that surprising, because it's one thing thinking that you've sent a few tweets and so on. It's another thing having enough evidence to bring somebody to court. So I'm not that surprised about that. I think that what does concern me is just that this inaction and lack of urgency with these issues will continue to confront us. And the response that there isn't enough funds and so on doesn't hold water. The police budget's gone through the roof over more than a decade. But what we're all lamenting is the absence of leadership, the absence of action. And no commission of inquiry is going to fix that. And this really is, I think, what worries many of us. It's not that we don't know what needs to happen. There are reams of paper, of commissions of inquiry that set out in great detail what needs to happen. We just don't do that. I mean, how can you carry on this way? Now, this happens in the security cluster, which, and I suspect the same largely holds in the other clusters. There is some change that needs to happen. The overlapping mandates of the national security system, the council and the secretariat, plus the justice and policing cluster obviously needs to be rationalized and so on. But for heaven's sake, when are we going to see some action on these issues?
Juanita, Yaki is decrying the fact that when are we going to see some action? There is talk, if you look at today's newspapers, the Sunday Times talks about the super presidency. It's not something that we are hearing about for the first time, given what some describe as the centralization of power within the presidency. Is that where solutions are going to come from if we are to move this discussion forward?
The thing is, Toli, is that at the end of the day, it's the roster within the executing department. So you can shuffle things around on paper, and you can give a new address to a department. You could bring in task teams. At the end of the day, it's cancer, right? And that's the whole problem with the inefficiency in the state. And obviously, we know that this has been happening for years and years and years. And so rebuilding has to happen from the ground up. There needs to be good leadership. There needs to be stability in leadership. There needs to have all of these parallel discussions that need to happen at the same time. And so what you can't have, and that's what has been the case for a long time in the Ramaphosa administration, is that you have one move. You have Behicele appointed as police minister, and then we put all our eggs in that basket. You have a Sydney Mufamadi report, and that's going to fix it all. Now we have this Professor Sandy Africa report, and Professor Sandy Africa makes it very clear. Her report was not a forensic investigation. It was not a criminal investigation. It was understanding why was July allowed to happen by the security forces. The criminal process still needs to unfold. Someone asked me the other day, why was the issue of Phoenix not addressed? Phoenix is a murder investigation that needs to happen by our police and the Hawks and the NPA. This is not something. This was to get to the center of why do we have the situation that we currently have. And then an interesting thing you talk about was one can't fault the question is these instigators. What happened to these instigators? If you read the report very carefully, and again, this is also my own assessment of the situation, we write it in our book 8 Days in July, The thing about 12 instigators or whatever was smokescreen. It was a PR stunt when government didn't know what was happening and they did not know how to control it. So what they did was they created the smoke and mirrors of having these, we have this intelligence that's pointing to these 12 instigators. What they had was a list of 12 people who were tweeting, and like Jackie said, it's very hard to take a few tweeters and charge them. I mean, they've tried to do that. Then the other thing is, and this is something quite fascinating in the report by Professor Sandy Afrika, to say if you have any information around instigators, there has to be a charge of terrorism, because if you don't charge of terrorism, and they go a bit of detail into what the charge should be, what the charge ought to be, because what we saw in July was nothing short of that. And so what happens is when you allow ministers to get away with it. Also, why was ministers appointing that? Ministers that do not have should not be going and arresting people anyways. It was the officials that needed to be talking to that, and that's exactly what the report says. There was so much of confusion, Goli, that what you had was ministers running around in KZN. You're a premier trying to physically arrest someone. I mean, that was completely bizarre and laughable, because they did not have a grip on the situation. They kept blaming each other, and then they usurped the powers of officials who were just completely paralyzed because of the lack of stability, the lack of direction, and one would even say resources.
You watching Politics Unscripted, the segment of the show. It is the debate uncensored, and we're discussing the July unrest report that has been released, looking into what essentially was a very, very ugly picture of our country back in July last year. The president termed it a failed insurrection. Tato, if I come to you and I ask the question, is it enough if the description around what occurred in July, if the description by the president was that this was a failed insurrection, is it enough that we have a few instigators that are going through or undergoing court processes right now? I spoke about masterminds earlier, and I don't think that we have one behind bars right now.
Yeah, so I think one problem around, and I'm glad that you asked the question around, the arrest of the masterminds. Currently, what we do know is that at the moment, the only people who are seen to be held accountable are those who form part of the lower echelons of what the NPA, according to their own categorization, would form part of the low-level looters. And unfortunately, those are the same communities where the relationship between the communities and the police are at an all-time low, of course. And this is something that the panel report highlights, is that the relationship between police and communities needs to be urgently repaired, because police need to be embedded in the communities with which they serve. And that would have, if the situation would have unfolded differently, the police would have been in a better position to have known what was coming. And so, unfortunately, what we do have here is that the poorest or the most vulnerable of people who may have been involved in the looting are carrying the lion's share of the burden or the responsibility of what has happened, which I think in and of itself will cause problems, I think, going further down the line, and will further corrode that relationship between the police and communities. So it is absolutely important that we see justice be carried out fairly and across the board. So not just targeting those who do not have access to lawyers and cannot get themselves out of jail quickly enough, or even prevent themselves from being arrested. We need to see those who are involved in the orchestrating of this unrest be held accountable. And that is incredibly important. Now, the other thing that comes up in the panel report is that, there's back and forth about what we call it. But I think it's also important to remember what lies at the core of it. So there's something that the report says about, staged, that the violence was made to seem orchestrated. But we can definitely say that there were probably a lot of people that were involved in the violence who may not have had anything to do with any kind of planning or aware of any kind of master plan.
Yeah.
But what we do need to be aware of are the circumstances that kind of laid the foundation for this kind of thing to really boil over. And those are like a very toxic mix of a really, very poor socioeconomic circumstances for people, a situation like COVID, which presents a shock to the system, a political climate that is incredibly tenuous and had been for a long time, and that just becomes like the perfect mix of a crisis like this. And as Dr. Celias mentioned at the beginning, which is what the report says, is this kind of thing can happen again. And so an important finding that the report makes, which, as a socioeconomic right, we would want to highlight, is that over and above the crisis in the security cluster, and there are many, we need to pay very close attention to the issues of poverty and inequality.
Yeah.
The quality of life under which South Africans and members of the public are made to live, having been forced into a lockdown for about 2 years with their income completely stripped, the SRD grant, which was at some point in place and then removed and then later reinstated. These are things that we have to pay close attention to. And as Kanita mentioned, there were warnings that 2020 would be a very volatile year because, unfortunately, people have been pushed into corners. The daily lived reality of people on the ground, the inability to provide for themselves, and all those, the social protections that are absolutely critical for people to just get by, have completely been eroded.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, what members of the public continue to see, I think, throughout the lockdown, where corruption was even taking place with the money that was allocated for COVID relief and that kind of thing, just contributes to the frustration.
Yeah.
And so if those kind of issues, in addition to dealing with the crisis in the security cluster, if we do not deal with how people are getting by and surviving, this kind of thing can happen and most probably will happen again if it isn't dealt with as appropriately as it should be.
Yaki, I like the words that are being used by Tato there, and she is quoting what the report is warning, that this could happen again. I want to also quote from that report when it says that, quote unquote, a culture of lawlessness existed in South Africa with the authority of the state being undermined without any visible plan to respond. I'm desperate to move South Africans, not just us here discussing this. I'm desperate to move South Africans for the key questions moving forward, or key actions that need to be asked of the authorities, of the president. What needs to happen now?
So let's look at them in three clusters. The first is that the origins of the challenge need to be addressed, which is factionalism within the governing party. If you don't fix that, the instability in the ANC will continue to spill over into the public and threaten all of us. None of us can do that except the top leadership within the ANC itself. The second is that we need to address the issues that have been laid bare on the security cluster, because we need to manage the violence going forward, because we are going to have, given the challenges we have going forward on poverty, inequality, we're going to have lots of that. So recommendations are clear. Appoint permanent people, bring stability, solve the challenges between the minister and the national commissioner and so on. Again, things that could be done within a month or so. The third deals with dealing with the underlying problems, the socioeconomic problems, poverty, inequality that have been mentioned. That requires economic growth. Nothing is possible without economic growth. It's the most important thing. And again, here you find, yes, we see tentative actions, but if we don't get the South African economy growing, and growing much more rapidly, we will face many, many challenges going forward. So for me, those three clusters are the areas that action is required. We know in all three of them what needs to be done. What is missing is action. Mandy, I think, referred to referred to the president as captain in action, and I thought there was quite a quite a nice expression of this lack of movement, this lack of action that we see on every area that we refer to. Maybe December will bring a victory for the reformist camp in the ANC. Maybe we will see some more concerted action in that, but it seems to be out of character, and that's what worries many of us.
Yeah. Juanita, you are a political watcher. Yaki says perhaps December will bring something different, something reassuring for the ANC and therefore their country whilst they are still in power. Do you foresee something like that happening?
No, we put our faith in an ANC conference in 2017 and it doesn't change structural problems in government and in the state. I think we'd be foolish to do it again and to think. And so, yes, there is the issue of ANC factionalism, but the issue, what we need to do is to foolproof the state so that we don't have the spillover of ANC factionalism, that the ANC can, tear itself apart or not, and it doesn't affect the safety of citizens. That's the issue. The issue is that the party can, and that's, I think, what the point was of Justice Zondo in the first two parts of his report, to say, like if you look at what happened at Janelle, for example, it was the repurposing of the governing party's deployment committee literally led to the destruction of a world-class arms manufacturing SOE. And so that's the conversation that we need to have now. We need to not, be sort of, sitting at the sidelines, of the bullfight, thinking that, if the best bull wins, then we'll be better off as spectators. That's not what we need to be doing. What we need to be doing now is having conversations and pushing in reforms around protecting the state, about how do you, and as Professor Sandy Africa says, maybe there needs to be a change in the constitution around the appointment of a police commissioner, and that it's not subject to, personal whims, people disliking each other. I mean, the irony of all of this, when the police minister was the police commissioner, he had a tense relationship with his minister, Natin Tetra, at the time. So he's just on the other end of it, Toli. So, I mean, that's the conversations that we need to be having right now, is that it is. The ANC spills over into the state. How do we then ensure that you have a professionalized criminal justice system? How do you have a professionalized law enforcement agency? And that comes with processes, that comes with amendment to legislation, that comes with a scrutiny of what is the president's intention by putting the State Security Agency into his office. Because at the end of the day, the Musanda building of the SSA is still going to exist in Pretoria. It's just, it's just on paper the move is going to happen. And you have a minister and you have a president who has to have his eye on so many other things. Is that the best decision? But again, we need to have tangible answers. Why did it take so long to fill a vacancy? And when you're filling the vacancy, can that be a public process? And I think that's the conversations that need to have overall structural changes. There needs to be, as the report mentioned, around, you need to make a decision. Are you going to go back to the old system of having the National Intelligence Agency dealing with foreign intelligence and SAS dealing with domestic intelligence? Because that was the recommendation. The process was started. It was supported. Make a decision and stand by the reform. Yeah. And I mean, I probably sound like a broken telephone. We can't be doing the same thing and expecting different results. What happens in December should be affecting, yes, it affects us in terms of, who could it be, be our leaders if the ANC is elected in 2024. But more than that, we can't hope that this country will be taken out of the quagmire that it is by the same people who put us in there.
Yeah. When we return, we're going to wrap up the discussion with my guests. You're watching Politics Unscripted. You're watching the debate uncensored, and we're wrapping it up with my panel of guests. We are discussing the July unrest report. Tato Masiangwako, let's come to you next. You are with the organization whose main concern is to do with the socio-economic rights of ordinary South Africans. My question to you is that if this report is warning that the inequalities that exist in the country are part and parcel of what we saw in July, how in the world are we going to change this situation around when the economy basically has been stagnating since 10 years ago and the rates of growth are pedestrian, as Michael Sachs described them in a paper recently? So what hope is there that, economically speaking, things are going to change for the better in the country?
Yeah, that is a very difficult question, and unfortunately, I don't have the answers, other than to say that honestly, government does need to get its act together and prioritize issues of socioeconomic rights. What we cannot just accept is a budget that just spews out austerity as we saw last year. We don't know what will happen this year, but for people who crunched the numbers and looked at how the budget was actually dealing with the poorest of the poor. So the social grants that people were being granted, I think that actually went down in real terms, in terms of how much was added to it. And so we really do just have to demand that government really prioritizes the issue of poverty and inequality. And it's not to say that they're not, except unfortunately they're not doing a good enough job at dealing with those issues. We're speaking about things like access to housing, access to land, access to basic services. And, unfortunately, this is the thing. This is our experience in civil society, is that actually when COVID-19 hit, for many of us, it was the first time we actually saw government being as responsive as it was. Yeah. For the first time, we saw water being rolled out at lightning speed. And it's not that there haven't been problems since then, but what we did see was, for a very brief moment, was that government is in fact capable. And for the first time, actually, government was really open to engaging with communities and civil society. What we need to see is that continuing, right? We need to see that being carried out and being, fed into the way that it does its work. Yeah. I'll leave it there.
Dr. Cilliers, as a security expert, I was quite intrigued about how the report, in a way, painted the police as being faced with something that was extraordinary and humanizing, I think, police officers for a change. And that was to say they were faced with either shooting with rubber bullets or even deploying tear gas to a woman who is carrying a child on her back. And that person is merely there to take advantage of the situation that is unfolding in front of them. And so you have to think of the police officer and the decision that he or she has to make at that point. Do we sometimes put unnecessary pressure, or do we think that police officers are capable of Superman powers?
I think we expect a lot from our police. They're delivering below our expectations because they are poorly led and poorly managed, and that comes from the top. Let's fix the top by permanent appointments of capable men and women, appointed by an independent panel, and that can be done relatively quickly. And then let's support them in rationalizing the top structures of the police. We have a highly centralized and one of the largest centralized police agencies in the world. Let's decentralize, slim its top structures down, decentralize decentralize activities to provinces, to metropolitan areas, and so on, and bring the police down. It's a political issue for the ANC. It should not be. No other country has the kind of centralized, top-heavy structure that we have. And there are many things that have been recommended over many years with regard to the re-establishment of the railway police and specialized units, sorting out the central firearms registry, and so on and so forth. Things that could be done literally within a matter of months. Look at how we've turned SARS around. It can be done within the police as well. And then let's sort out the national security structures, that requires just a degree of will and leadership by the president. None of this is rocket science. It's really all about basics and really all about taking control of the situation, as was mentioned by Tatu during the COVID-19 reaction, where we did see really remarkable reaction in the early months by government. It can be done.
Yeah. Juanita Hunter, you probably have the last bite at the cherry. I want to throw forward to the discussion that we're going to have at 5 with yet more of my guests, and that is the extension of the social relief of distress grant. If inequalities are part and parcel of the unrest that we saw, were part of the galvanizing factor, if you like. The extension of this 350 rand to March of next year, surely that's not sustainable. We need something that is a lot more predictable. People want to know whether this is going to exist for a longer period, and that's why there is a huge discussion about a basic income grant that perhaps should come into force. Is that what we probably are looking ahead to?
I mean, you just look at the face of Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana, after the State of the Nation address, and he almost has this look. In fact, he said it's going to be very expensive to implement what was just announced, and one understands that the difficulty of the position that he is, considering the levels of debt that South Africa has, and just the amount of challenges and demands that is being placed on the fiscus. Now, the issue about the basic income grant, a decision will have to ultimately be made. Whether you go for it or you don't go for it, you're going to upset some people. The difficulty, though, is what's going to come is that it's going to be increasingly, if not difficult, if not impossible, to cancel the 359 SRD grant, come March next year, because people are benefiting from it. The other issue is just the efficiency of that system. The fact that government employees are have applied for it and received it. People who are not eligible for it. And then the other issue is how much of state mismanagement of funds can be used to actually support this initiative. And maybe there needs to be a complete rethink of the budget, instead of doing more of the same and then just trying to find more money where there isn't, to fund programs like this. At the end of the day, a very important lesson was learned in July last year. South Africa is a tinderbox fueled by poverty, inequality, and unemployment. It is completely unsustainable. There has to be formidable reforms in place, immediate and medium to long term. And at the end of the day, the indecisiveness around whether they're going to have a basic income grant or kicking the can down the road is not going to solve the problem. This problem is choose a stance, take the flak that comes whichever way it goes, and start working towards what Dr. Salia says, growing the economy, because that solves a lot of your problems.
Juanita Hunter, you are the political editor at News24. Let me thank you for your time. Also the co-author of a book, 8 Days in July. Tato Siangwako is from the Socioeconomic Rights Institute. Thank you very much for your participation in this important discussion. Dr. Yaki Salias, as always, thank you to you for making yourself available time and again when we call on you from the Institute of Security Studies. That's